Hello everyone, my name is Marcelo. I'm a master's in kinesiology student at UTEP. Formerly, I did my bachelor's degree in exercise science and wellness at Long Island University, where I was also a Division I swimmer. I'm presenting to you guys the biomechanics of front crawl performance in swimming. I think it's the most basic and fundamental of all the strokes, and it's also the one that gives us the most to talk about, with the most research about it. Give a brief introduction. The story of speed and high-level performance is mostly told through the variables of propulsion and resistive forces, otherwise known as drag. Drag force is also amplified by the speed of the swimmer, which causes it to be even more important to manage as the race goes on and as the race potentially gets shorter and the swimmers get faster. Now, for perspective, the drag forces that experienced high-level sprinters are facing are similar to that of a Formula One car. This is because of the density of the water, and that's why managing resistive forces has been central to performance over the last 20 years, which has led to quite an explosion in performance and in breaking of world records. The reason for this is because propulsion and drag are simultaneously working on a swimmer, but we can only measure one at a time because of technological limitations. And this has been at the center of a lot of research breakthroughs, is finding new methods and the ability to integrate a multi-method approach. Now, the foundations of propulsion. Front crawl performance is created by a combination of lift and thrust. Lift force is created by this here, essentially, the pitching down of the hand, and that will cause a slight press down here in the water, which will give buoyancy to the swimmer, keep them afloat, and keep them, the higher their body is in the water, the less resistive force that they're going to be facing. Lift is a concept that was less well understood and is now being explored through computational methods or simulations. Now that depends on the pitch depends on excuse me, the lifting forces depend on the pitch here. Now the creation of forward momentum depends on the vertical positioning of the forearm, which we see here. This vertical positioning of the forearm allows the swimmer to drive water backwards, as you can see. So they'll pitch down, lift themselves up a bit, grab the water here in the front, and then here they'll drive backwards. And the swimmer's body will also rotate laterally to give space for the wave to go underneath them. It's the wave that's underneath the swimmer. Now, this is part of a larger branch of observation, which is called fluid dynamics, which is the behavior of the water around the swimmer at any given point. This has been mostly studied kind of relatively newly, and this has been mostly done with computational methods, simulations that allow us to observe the way water behaves under different conditions. And these methods have allowed us to understand how a swimmer's movement, their body position, and how those things contribute to the behavior of the water and creating optimal flow, and also the creation of vortices that we reference here, small tornadoes of water that also contribute to lift. Those are finer points that are kind of beyond what meets the eye. Our next variable that we'll discuss is resistive forces. These resistive forces are constraining the speed that a swimmer can achieve constantly, because resistive forces are constantly working against the swimmer. Now, managing these forces has led to an extreme explosion in performance in the last couple of years. Prior to our understanding, our modern understanding, drag forces were mainly understood through the lens of metabolic cost, as in how much fatigue is the swimmer building up in trying to overcome these resistive forces. The early studies and the early metabolic understanding of resistive forces was tested mechanically, using mechanical systems that artificially placed resistance to the swimmer or used mechanical force to otherwise estimate the impact of drag forces. But these kind of studies were not ecologically valid, as these methods did not reflect actual swimming, and they changed the conditions of the swimming and of the swimmer, and were not able to account for the differences in stroke mechanics, body position, and fatigue that these methods cause. Our understanding of drag only emerged when we began to use computational methods. And these computational methods, the way they work is they create a 3D environment filled with billions of particles that have been trained and programmed to behave as a fluid does. And then they create a 3D model of a swimmer. The swimmer goes into the environment here, the 3D model of the swimmer, and then they can observe how their movement and other things will affect the way the water behaves. And this has led to an understanding of things that surround the swimmer, the aquatic structures like pressure fields, the disruptions in flow that come from improper body position, and the way that those things affect the way the water behaves. And now, the issue prior to that was these mechanics of managing resistive forces are something that swimmers understand implicitly. High level swimmers, especially through thousands of hours of training, become to understand how to be more efficient in the water and how to overcome those forces just implicitly, so that it's not something that's really spoken about. And as such, only the most high level coaches have ever been able to explicitly state that to their swimmers what they need to do to manage those forces. The way that we relate propulsion and drag together as a system is through this concept of net thrust. A really simple equation here, which means that thrust is equal to the difference of propulsion to the resistive force that a swimmer must overcome. Now, this seems extremely simple, but it does have applications that because as drag forces do increase with the speed of a swimmer, at that point, propulsive force, more power, does not result in a proportional increase in speed. And this 2022 review describes what he calls a threshold of propulsive force, which is past the point of propulsion. Adding more force will only yield more resistive force and less speed. This threshold is typically capped by a swimmer's skill level and their ability to manage those resistive forces at higher speeds while applying more force and improving their speed, increasing their speed in a way that's not going to make them also be exposed to resistive forces. So the threshold of propulsive force is dictated by skill. But what is skill? Researchers have identified a few common characteristics that classify a swimmer's skill level. The first of which is consistent propulsive time ratio. And to briefly explain, the three phases of the stroke include the catch, which is the phase with the lifting force, the propulsion phase, which is the phase with the vertical forearm that drives the water backwards, and then the recovery is the part of the stroke where the swimmer brings their hand back over the water and then back to the front. Now, elite swimmers are able to maintain a consistent ratio of time spent in the propulsive phase of the stroke, which means that they're spending the same proportion of time sending water backwards as opposed to catching the water and recovering their arm over the top of the water. The same exact ratio, no matter what speed they're going through. Now, if a person is less experienced, they're going to try to gain speed by going through the propulsive phase more quickly, pulling the water more aggressively, which usually results in grabbing less water and also messing up their alignment and exposing themselves to more resistive forces. Another skill that we see in elite swimmers is acceleration of the hand during the propulsive phase. I'll use this here. During this phase here, this is the early propulsion phase. It's going to drive the hand back this way. As you might think it will be a consistent mechanical drive backwards, it's not. It's actually kind of unsteady, and it relies on boom, burst of speed, boom, burst of speed, boom, burst of speed, and then dragging the arm out. Unsteady explosions of speed like that, and those are actually generating lifting forces by creating vortices, the little tornadoes of water that we spoke about earlier, and they're also increasing the amount of water that the swimmer is driving backwards. As they drive backwards one time and then the water goes backwards, as they push hard there, some water already carries momentum and keeps going backwards, but their arm stays here and they can get more and keep pushing. And that kind of unsteady acceleration is a key hallmark or trait of elite swimmers. Another simpler trait is simply the coordination of the stroke, which means the synchronization of all of the mechanics, the catch, the pull, the rotation, and everything. It's all one smooth movement, and it creates a even stroke rhythm that's consistent over time. Constantly the same amount of time taking the kind of a consistent tempo. And also this consistency and this smoothness of the stroke is also able to keep them safe from being exposed to resistive forces. Now, intracycle velocity variability, this is due to the fact that drag, because the swimmer is surrounded by water, is constantly working against them. but they're only able to generate propulsion as long as their arm is sending water backwards. So this leads to intermittent changes in speed, accelerating when the arm is going backwards, and then when they're not creating any propulsion, they are decelerating because drag is constantly working against them. This leads to changes in speed within the same stroke cycle. This is called intracycle velocity fluctuations. And due to the coordination of more high-level swimmers, they're able to minimize these and create smoother, more consistent acceleration through their stroke. As you can see here, he is in the early, probably terminal catch phase, early propulsive phase. He's going to start sending the water backwards here. Until his arm reaches about here, he will still be creating propulsion. And as you can see, this arm is just about ready to come into the water and initiate the catch phase. So right when this arm finishes the propulsive phase, this arm finishes the propulsive phase, it will begin the recovery phase right when he's getting done with his catch phase. So his intracycle velocity variability will be lower because he is almost constantly generating propulsion. As you can see, non-expert swimmers have about a 15 to 25% intracycle velocity variation, and elite swimmers, like our friend right here, keep it more towards 5 to 7%. That difference is very, very big. Another hallmark of skill, one of the most important ones, is adaptability, which is the ability of an elite swimmer to change their stroke mechanics in the ways that we outline here, to change their stroke mechanics, to be efficient at managing resistive forces while increasing their speed. While becoming faster in the water, they're able to change subtly things like hand pitch, the timing of the vertical position of the forearm, the timing of their accelerations through the propulsive phase, and also modulating stroke length and stroke frequency and timing when they're going to take a breath. All of these things will change to manage resistive forces as the swimmer gets faster. As you might remember, resistive forces increase with the square of the speed of the swimmer. So that's why these kinds of changes, technical changes during the race, make a big difference to manage those resistive forces. So adaptability refers to the ability to change their stroke as they're accelerating in these subtle ways here. Now, some of the early technologies that we use to measure the things that we now understand, such as adaptability, mechanics, and whatnot, they began with kind of crude mechanical studies like this, which is a swimmer swimming along the pool and pushing against these pads like this. So these are mechanically precise, but these are not ecologically valid conditions for a swimmer. Another one is methods like velocity perturbation method and the MRT, which are artificially adding drag to the swimmer to measure what are the changes in velocity, and that's how we estimate the cost of drag, through changes in velocity by adding artificial drag. This does not account for changes in technique caused by the artificial drag or the body position or the fatigue as the trials go on. Now, the assisted towing method, an example is right here, except the swimmer would be swimming towards the pulley. The swimmer would be getting pulled along by the pulley, and the mechanical force used by the pulley would be used to estimate using the mechanical force used by the pulley plus the changes in velocity of the swimmer were used to estimate the differences in velocity caused by drag. This does not account for how different it is to swim with a pulley towing you along, or for the changes in the fluid mechanics that are happening if the swimmer is not creating the propulsion themselves. But back then they didn't even really understand this. These were evaluated in a literary review here, which explains why essentially it was mechanically valid but not ecologically valid. And a more modern research now looks like using technologies like this, like underwater cameras, high-speed video, so we can see in slow motion, frame by frame, what the swimmer is doing from many different angles. Also, 3D simulations of the body, as we described earlier, and also a motion capture integration as well. Motion capture methods to see in 3D what the swimmer is doing, how they're behaving, and how those differences in mechanics are affecting the outcomes that we want to measure. In a 2017 Dutch study, they were actually able to use low profile pressure sensors in the hands of the swimmers. And this was combined with high-speed video and 3D underwater motion capture. But the low profile, pressure sensors were able to detect the direction that the swimmer was pushing the water at each of the different phases. And that helped us understand a lot about lifting forces, about timing and mechanics and things like that. So that's a really good example of multi-method integration, which is also a hallmark of modern research, multi-method integration, and using kind of superior methods now with technology to create outcomes that we really want to see. Another important breakthrough is the computational methods, as we described. These computational methods include, yes, the 3D environment, the 3D model of the body, and the only limitation I would say here is that you can only modulate certain things. As you can see right here, you can change the leg length, the torso length, the arm length, but you cannot account for things like flexibility. You cannot account for more complex and human-like movements, as these methods were typically developed and used for cars or planes or other kind of physics things, not for something bendy and flexible like the human body. That's why these methods have not replaced experimental methods. If anything, they have become a complement to the experimental methods, and they have worked. The superior and most advanced and best data that we have is typically from studies that employ both. And when I say both, I mean computational and experimental methods. So we'll synthesize here more or less what some of the evolution of the literature has looked like, which begins in the 1990s, which, as we referred to earlier, focused a lot on energy expenditure, and they viewed propulsion as a mechanical action. As you can remember by those early studies, how they were carried out is a mechanical thing, and drag was mostly viewed as a fatigue, as a factor of fatigue and energetic cost. The 2000s and the 2010s have led to an understanding of mechanics and how those affect propulsion and resistive forces, and this has led to an understanding of the importance of drag reduction and being efficient in your propulsion to manage resistive forces. Now, these breakthroughs here in understanding resistive forces and effective propulsion, it corresponds with a time of unparalleled evolution in the sport. So from 2000 to 2009, over 130 world records were broken, with improvements of 3 to 4% in a single year, when what we expected, if a world record was broken at all, would be 0.1 to 0.3, and we were getting 3 to 4% here. Now, more world records were also broken during 2008 and 2009 than in the entire 1990s. Yeah. Evolution of the 2020s has been mostly an integrated phase where researchers are now understanding things from a systems perspective, understanding that propulsion and drag are not two different variables, but they are actually two parts of the same interrelated system, which is described by net thrust. And in this phase, it has been mostly about integrating our understanding of biomechanics, our understanding of fluid mechanics and whatnot, and integrating these two types of methods that we have, which are experimental and computational, to expand our understanding of this. And this shows that the field has kind of been moving in this direction for a while, and what we see now is a superior systems level understanding, and that's led to a lot of breakthroughs in the sport. From the 7 studies that I've analyzed, excuse me, in this literary review, a few universal principles of swimming performance have emerged. Firstly, propulsion and drag, as we discussed, are not separate variables, but they belong within the same system, and what describes this system is net thrust. Second of all, managing the resistive forces faced by a swimmer through technical precision is more important than total force production. Now, third, expert swimmers are characterized by a consistent propulsive time ratio, intracycle velocity, coordination, and the ability to adapt their skills to varying velocities. The gaps that remain in the literature are due to some technological and methodological limitations, which include uh, the lack of existence of a method to measure active drag in real time. We currently rely on computational methods and mathematical approximations. Another limitation is computational methods render the 3D body in a very rigid and still kind of inaccurate way, which is why the best data in the field um, relies on an integration of computational methods and experimental methods together. But as of yet, few such studies exist. And lastly, many of the studies that we have observed rely on sub-elites or younger swimmers. So the data on true elite swimmers is limited because obviously getting them to participate in studies would be kind of difficult. Conclusion, the body of literature about swimming has increased tremendously in its volume, precision, and depth in the past 3 decades. This has led to an emphasis in finding the best approach to reduce resistive forces and has led in the past 2 decades to an unprecedented level of improvement in swimming performance. This emphasis on drag reduction has spread to swimming technology like swimsuits, goggles, and has even seen a collaboration between Speedo and NASA. All this to say, to wrap up everything, the fastest swimmers are not the strongest or the most powerful, but the ones that are best able to solve the complex problems facing them in real time, adapt their approach to different speeds, and remain consistent in the face of fatigue. I would love to thank the researchers, coaches, and athletes that have pushed this sport to new levels throughout my life and especially throughout my childhood. I would like to thank all my former teammates and coaches, all of my classmates, and a special thank you to Dr. Eagleston, my research mentor, and hopefully my professor who's going to give me an extension. Thank you very much.